Well, good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's 2019 Anzac Day Last Post ceremony, marking the 104th anniversary of the landing at Gallipoli. My name's Richard Cruz, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Navy is Commodore Peter Levy. On this day, 104 years ago, Australians and New Zealanders fought side by side, landing in a place far from their homelands, a place that would become known as Anzac Cove. Though the Gallipoli campaign would end 9 months later, with the evacuation, those survived would be joined by many reinforcements to fight for another 3 years, until the guns finally fell silent on the 11th of November 1918. On land, sea and air, from a nation of less than 5 million, 62,000 gave their lives in an Australian uniform. A further 155,000 were wounded or imprisoned. From a nation of around 1 million, around 18,000 New Zealanders were killed and more than 40,000 wounded. When writing about the evacuation from Gallipoli, Charles Bean stated, "For the withdrawing Anzacs, Gallipoli had a special meaning. It was not merely that Australians and New Zealanders had been killed and more had been wounded or were prisoners, but for the standard set by the first companies at the first call, by the stretcher bearers, the medical officers, the staffs, the company leaders, the privates, the defaulters on the water barges, the light horse at the neck. This was already part of the tradition, not only of Anzac, but of Australian and New Zealand peoples. By dawn on December 20th, Anzac had faded into a dim blue line, lost amid other hills on the horizon, as the ships took their human freight to Imbros, Lemnos and Egypt. But Anzac stood and still stands for the reckless valour in a good cause, for enterprise, resourcefulness, fidelity, comradeship and endurance that will never own defeat. Over a century of service, the Australian and New Zealand Defence Forces have continued to serve together across the world in war operations and peacekeeping. This evening we are honoured to acknowledge His Excellency Korhan Karakosh, Turkish Ambassador to Australia, and Mrs Svetlana Karakosh, Vice Admiral Arjamand Tuliulu, Turkish Fleet Commander and accompanying delegation, Mr Alistair Coe, Leader of the Opposition, Legislative Assembly, Australian Capital Territory, Mr Gordon Ramsay, Australian Capital Territory Minister for Veterans and Seniors, Wing Commander Sharon Bown, representing the Chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, the Honourable Dr Brendan Nelson, Director of the Australian War Memorial, and Ms Gillian Adamson, members of the Australian War Memorial Council, and Mrs Shirley Percival, President, ACT War Widows Association, and the Indigenous Leadership and Resilience Delegation. As always, we welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We also welcome 224 and 241 Army Cadet Unit, also representatives of the New Zealand Cadet Corps. We acknowledge the members of RSL Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. And during this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by visitors to the memorial. Australia's Federation Guard is a tri-service ceremonial unit of the Australian Defence Force. They provide a ceremonial presence at civil and military events and during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries. The Guard will now dismount the catapult party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier within the Hall of Memory. If you're able, I invite you all to please stand and join in singing the national anthem.
Catapult Party, attention! Catapult Party, present! Arms!
Australians, all let us rejoice, for we are young and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil, our home is birth by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts, of beauty rich and rare. In history's page let every state advance Australia fair. In joyful strains then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
Catapult Party, shoulder! Arms! Catapult Party, order! Arms!
If you're able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn their loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and operations for more than a century. But first we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths and floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Sergeant Charles James Backman. Charles Backman was born on the 14th of April 1884 in Adelaide, the son of Annie and Charles Backman. He attended Curry Street School in Adelaide and went on to work as a boilermaker's assistant with the South Australian Railways. Known by the nickname Rappy, Backman was an outstanding cricket player. He played for South Australia in the 1911-12 Sheffield Shield season and competed against England in an international match. Backman was amongst the first to enlist in the Australian Imperial Force, doing so less than a month after the announcement of war. Having had experience in the 10th Australian Infantry Regiment, known as the Adelaide Rifles, he was assigned to the 10th Battalion as a sergeant. The 10th Battalion was amongst the first infantry units raised for war. Recruited from South Australia during August 1914, after completing basic training, the battalion embarked for overseas service in October. After a brief stop in Western Australia, the battalion proceeded to Egypt. In the desert camps outside Cairo, the men trained to meet the threat posed by the Ottoman Empire to British interests in the Middle East and to the Suez Canal. On the 25th of April 1915, the 10th Battalion landed at Anzac Cove, ostensibly to assist a British naval operation which aimed to force the Dardanelles Strait and capture the Turkish capital, Constantinople. Forming part of the covering force, the 10th Battalion was amongst the first ashore at around 4:30 a.m. Commander Charles Dix, who was in charge of landing the covering force, had sensed that the boats had been off course. As they arrived at the shore, he shouted, "Tell the Colonel, the damn fools have taken us a mile too far north." While the historical record is silent on the exact fate of Charles Backman, Les Carline's exceptional book, Gallipoli, tells of the experience of a member of the 10th Battalion, a solicitor from Adelaide, which evokes what Backman may have gone through during the landing. As the landing force neared the shore, bullets started whizzing in all directions. The men crouched low in the boats. Bullets splashed into the water. One clattered into the mess tin on a soldier's back, but no one in the boat was wounded. He started half swimming, half wading for the shore. 3 times he went right under. He had landed near the centre of Anzac Cove. The beach was very rocky, and it was not the easiest thing on earth to clamber over big, slippery rocks. All this time, bullets were whizzing all around us, and men were falling here and there. I rushed across the shore to the shelter of a small bank, and there shed my pack and fixed my bayonet, and then straight on to drive the beggars away. The way our chaps went it was like a sight for the gods. No one attempted to fire, but we just went straight on up the side of the cliff, pushing our way through the thick scrub and often clambering up the steep sides of the cliff on all fours. Upon reaching the top of the first ridge, the men came under fire from fleeing Turks on the ridge ahead. Dawn was breaking and the Turks looked down on the Australians with the sun behind them. The early clashes at Gallipoli were without pity. Bean reports that an Australian party chased down a group of Turkish coastal sentries. As the Australians got in amongst them, the Turks threw down their rifles, but there were too many to capture. After the first few hours with the early rushers repulsed, they pushed on. The men of the 10th Battalion would penetrate the furthest inland during the initial fighting. Pushing through scrub full of snipers, small groups of men who had never been under fire before, some with no one in charge, would stay out there until driven back by the enemy, who attacked in force. From this point, as Carline writes, Gallipoli took on the first characteristics of what it was never supposed to be. It began to look like a siege. 3 days after the landing, a roll call was undertaken for the 10th Battalion, and as Sergeant Backman was reported as wounded and missing. The lack of news regarding his fate was particularly hard for his family, who wrote desperately seeking information. His brother wrote to the Minister of Defence in August 1915, desperately hoping for good news. "I sent yesterday to you about my brother, trying to find out news of him. I told you only of letters, but today I can tell you of men we have met, returned soldiers that met him there, and tell us that my brother was in a hospital in a bed next to one of them. And another letter I have just got from the hospital states that he is in that hospital with him now. A letter from one of his sisters reported, "If we do not get news one way or another, I'm sure that it will kill my mother as well, for it is awful waiting for news and none coming." In September 1915, Backman was made a life member of the Adelaide District Cricket Club in honour of his service. It wasn't until the 5th of June 1916 that a court of inquiry pronounced that he had been killed in action. Charles Backman was 31 years old when he died on the first day of the Gallipoli campaign. Having no marked grave, his name is listed on the Lone Pine Memorial at Gallipoli. A photograph of this is displayed beside the pool of reflection. His name is also listed on the Roll of Honour to my right, among almost 62,000 Australians who died while serving during the First World War. This is but one of the many stories of sacrifice and service told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Sergeant Charles James Backman, who gave his life for us, for our freedom, and in the hope of a better world.
If you're able, please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
Catapult Party Soldiers, arms.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Catapult Party present, arms.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget.
Catapult Party, our words, turn.
We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, cadets, girls and boys, that concludes this evening's last post ceremony. We thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.